Thank you for joining us for another edition of New England Chapter Connects. My name is Patrick Yo. I am a Massachusetts director for the APWA New England chapter and happy to be here with you today. Our topic for today, as Regina said, is community engagement strategies for public works projects. Public works projects face technical complexity, regulatory constraints, with communities often skeptical of change. While DPW teams excel at engineering solutions to meet infrastructure needs, meaningful community engagement can feel resource-intensive or outside traditional work scope. At the same time, community feedback can slow or halt public projects, which can inflate budgets and timelines. By integrating accessible engagement into standard practices, public works departments can avoid these obstacles with the negative project outcomes that follow. This presentation shares practical strategies learned for integrating meaningful community engagement into engineering work. We hope you leave today with actionable strategies for future community engagement, translating technical information effectively, and hosting productive conversations. Just a couple of things before we get started. A special thanks needs to go out to our APWA New England chapter sponsors, because without their support, we cannot bring all of the valuable programs and events to our members and the public works community. All chapter events are made possible because of generous sponsors' support. Their continued investment in our chapter is so important, so thank you so much to our chapter sponsors. We believe and hope that you'll find the New England Chapter Connects series worthwhile and informative. We started this webinar series back in 2020 to help our community stay connected. Your continued attendance over the course of 6 years is a testament that taking a 1-hour break to learn something new brings value to the communities that we all serve. We are always looking for new ideas and ways to give back to you. So please let us know what you'd like to see for future sessions. This is our first session for our 2026 series. Our next sessions will be in April and May before a nice summer break, with our final 3 sessions in September, October, and November. If you miss a session or would like to replay a session for your staff, all of the New England Chapter Connects webinars can be found on the New England Chapter website. Lastly, please visit newengland.apwa.org for more information on becoming an APWA member, upcoming New England Chapter Connect sessions, APWA conferences and events, or becoming an APWA sponsor. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Chanel is a senior water resources engineer with a Master of Public Health and 9 years of experience in civil and site development projects, including multi-phase schools, large campuses, and permitting. Allison is a senior planner and community engagement specialist with 9 years of experience working at the intersection of urban planning, urban design, and resilience. She has worked on the city side, client side, and consulting side of the development industry, which has given her insight into the competing priorities a project must serve. Madeline is a transportation engineer with 6 years of professional experience in transportation engineering, transportation planning, and land development. She specializes in multimodal infrastructure design, parking and feasibility studies, work traffic zone management plans, and conceptual plans for a variety of audiences. With that, I'll pass the mic to today's presenters.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having us today. Allison, Maddie, and I are all really excited to share about some of the projects we've presented and worked on for community engagement strategies. And this presentation is about community engagement strategies for public works projects specifically. So as our next slide shows, the 3 presenters, we work in a few different departments, but we all come together for our community engagement efforts across the company. And on our next slide, it's just a little bit of information about niche engineering, which you may have heard of. We have 5 offices across the New England region, and our services range from civil engineering, planning, transportation engineering, structural, land surveying, green infrastructure, and resilience in GIS. We do a lot of projects like culvert replacements and stormwater infrastructure, and we know that our projects may look a little bit different than your projects or what your day-to-day looks like. But from the projects that we've worked on with community engagement, we think that a lot of those lessons are transferable, and especially some of the tools we've been able to employ and develop and use. And so today's presentation is about how we can take some of those techniques and work together with teams in other communities. Our learning objectives and framework for the day. three main ones. The first one is translating the technical to the accessible. So how can we take our technical designs and make them accessible to the community so they can understand what's going on? The second is being proactive with our engagement versus reactive. That'll be a big theme in our case studies from today. And then the last one, arguably the most important for a lot of us, is working with trade-offs. When we know that our resources are constrained or we just don't have all the tools available, what can we do to meet our project goals while trying to serve the community? A quick agenda for today. We're going to start with an overview of what community engagement is. We'll go into case studies on specific projects that the three of us have worked on together or separately and what we've learned from those projects. What worked really well, what didn't work so great, what kind of tools we used along the way. And then at the very end, we'll save time for a question and answer section.
All right, so just to kick us off and make sure we're all approaching it with community engagement with the same definition and foundation and intentions, a lot of this Patrick actually just mentioned. But when we talk about community engagement, we're referring to the intentional process of involving people who live, work, and spend time in the project's communities, bringing them in to shape the decisions that influence their environment that they live in every day. And really, no one does that more than DPW, whether people see it or not. Those are all the systems that no one thinks about when they're working and then get really mad when they don't. So we really believe that effective engagement helps reduce pushback, which, as Patrick mentioned, means fewer delays. Projects then are delivered on time and on budget. We know that engagement often feels superfluous and is the first thing to be cut out of a project or a budget. But we know we've all gotten those angry calls, people claiming they didn't know anything about this or something was decided for them, and then the snowball effect of how that affects our project bottom line. And so some benefits of community engagement that really help affect that bottom line and influence that success is that doing it well builds trust with communities and helps us establish enduring relationships. It increases transparency of projects. People feel more involved in how things are coming online into their environments. It promotes equity. A lot of pushback around equity can lead to delays, community discontent, and reinforcing disparities in our environments. It empowers communities. People love to see how their voices can shape outcomes and increase agency and ownership. And again, it improves outcomes with grounded community-informed projects that are more resilient, meaning they are more likely to serve the community over time. They're more relevant to what people need and more sustainable in the long run, based on a smooth bottom line. And we also know that in your work, it's also required for things like MS4 permitting or grant funding, and you all deal with it a little bit differently. Next slide. So specifically speaking to the intersection of engagement and DPW work, we know you all are facing some unique constraints, but you also have some unique assets as well. Of course, I've spent my time in municipal government. We know there's limited resources, staffing, budgeting, timelines, regulatory drivers, and then you combine those with the internal labyrinth of bureaucracy, and that can really be difficult to bring anything online. But also, all of those people that we work with and have to get approvals from is a deep bench of knowledge and resources and relationships that we can leverage to better our engagement. We know sometimes you all are fighting an established public perception of what the city does and how the city deals with things, that may feel like we're coming in on the back foot already when we're dealing with the public. But that's also an asset in that you have an established presence and relationship with the community. We know there are a complex network of stakeholders outside of your cities and towns. There's businesses, there's residents, there's regulatory agencies that we all need to meet standards for. But also those community ties are similar to that established presence. Those are things we can leverage to bring in new voices when we are designing so that people can really have this sense of long-term stewardship of their environment. And we know you all are usually coming in when the visioning for projects has already been completed. These things have been in the pipeline for months or years even. There was probably a flashy visioning project at some point, maybe even 5, 10 years ago when your comprehensive plan was built. And now you're being tasked with bringing things online and people can't make that connection of where they came from. Um, DPW can sometimes feel left out of those early conversations and be left out of those early conversations where infrastructure is actually a critical part of that conversation, and we'll touch on that later. But you also benefit from being in the system that is creating these projects because you have knowledge of the projects before they begin. And maybe that can be leveraged into earlier engagement, which is something we are always pushing with our efforts. So speaking to that, based on our work that we're going to go through and our case studies, we have these four, we call them tent poles of engagement that we apply to our projects. And this is just based on what we learned and what has been most effective in our work. So like I mentioned earlier, timing, engaging people as early as possible. And it can be as often as possible too, early and often, but really getting any sort of word out to the community that things are coming online. Um, People just want to know and feel like they were included, even if it's something as simple as signage along, a route that's going to be closed can make people feel a lot more positive about the work that's going on. We want people to feel ownership. We mentioned that earlier. We find that that is available even at the project stage that a DPW would work at. As we go through our design projects, we try to look for opportunities where we can ask people for feedback on any small decision about what's coming to them. If there's a small bit of leftover space for, would you rather see plants or signs or something like that? Generally, there is something that we can ask them just to kind of build that sense of ownership. Methods. We try to choose approachable methods that meet people where they are and are accessible, whether that's physically getting out into the public at town events or making things available online or in different languages if you have the resources and needs, always important. And finally, education. We have been really pushing on including educational materials and education as part of our outreach efforts. That helps close knowledge gaps to make more enriching conversations on both ends. We like to educate people on both the technology of what's going on. For example, we do a lot of green infrastructure work. So, and obviously for Maddie's transportation work, educating people on what these methods that we're introducing actually are, what are their benefits, and then what are the trade-offs, helps people feel more, again, ownership and ready for those changes that come. So now Maddie's going to walk us through a few case studies.
Yeah, so I'll take us through a variety of projects that we've worked on in the past. These are planning processes, which have a stronger community engagement component, as well as some more technical design projects that we've worked on, and how those tie into grant applications as you look to get some of these funded, and how maintenance strategies can tie into public engagement as well. We recognize that some of these may not be strictly DPW projects, but our hope is that there are some tools and some lessons learned from this variety of projects that we've worked on that can be helpful as you and your staff approach engagement as well. So the first one is a planning project that we worked on in Groveland, Massachusetts. This was a site analysis on an old gravel pit that had fallen into disuse. And the town asked us to look at development opportunities and balance those with some sensitive ecological considerations. This was a project where there are some real infrastructure constraints, which were a driving factor. And so early DPW involvement would have been really beneficial to understand how those would actually work. The residents were pretty protective over this open space as well. So that ties into our educational component. We built this story map to explain how the Aquifer Protection District that was present on the site overlapped or didn't overlap with some of the development schemes that we were considering, as well as site access and generally how we can leverage economic development that was really necessary in this town with those ecological considerations. So the story map helped share some of our analysis, and then we got out into the community and we tabled at Groveland Day, which was their town fair. There was a variety of vendors and booths, and so we had one and we shared some visuals of how we were approaching the economic development and the scale that those would be. And so we were able to meet a wide variety of people because residents were already attending the town fair, and then they had that sense of ownership over, hey, you're going to see some changes. How would you feel about this sort of program or this option? People were really in favor of a community trail through that open space, promoting access, and then we're a little more hesitant about things like light industrial. And so understanding how people felt about those different ways helped inform our future recommendations for the site. Another planning project we worked on, the Revere Walk, Bike, and Roll Prioritization Project. We worked on this with MAPC and identified priority routes for enhanced multimodal infrastructure. This is my bread and butter. I had a lot of fun on this project. And I know that the city is now referencing this plan as part of their grant applications to get some of these projects moving through the pipeline. Allison will talk a little bit more about grant applications in a minute, but we utilized a wide variety of community engagement strategies as part of this, including a survey of the community to start out with, as well as a working group that was present throughout the length of the project. We had an open house public meeting, and there was local media involvement and visualizations to help people picture. I can put together plans all day, but that doesn't necessarily translate into things that people can understand if they aren't used to looking at engineering plans. So the working group was really great. They were able to provide feedback throughout the life of the project. I had some ideas when I first looked at a map of Revere about, oh, I think like this destination would be really great, but understanding how people interacted with the streets was really useful to have the on the ground information. And then getting students to have buy-in and ownership. There was a really strong contingent of high school students that shared their opinions on the survey. And then the open house that we hosted was at the high school shortly after school let out. And so high school students came and they shared their opinions. High school students are often the ones who are walking and biking because they are literally not old enough to drive yet. So hearing their on the ground experience, and they identified a lot of the same aspects that I was looking at, hey, there's nowhere safe for me to cross here, so I have to run across and traffic's moving really fast. So like this plan where you're increasing the number of crossings would be really great. This plan also kind of created a pipeline of DPW projects, and understanding their maintenance constraints helped our final recommendations be stronger and more implementable. From a more technical design project lens, we worked on the Cummins Highway redesign in Boston. This was a DPW-led project to reconfigure Cummins Highway to reduce vehicle speeds. We had heard prior to the projects that vehicle speeds had nearly doubled in the past year prior to the kickoff. And we utilized a variety of methods again, including more standard public meetings, and then quick build demonstrations with temporary infrastructure like flex posts and paint. And we had pop-ups at the farmers market, as well as another story map like the one I mentioned in Groveland. There was some community skepticism of city priorities here. They felt like this project came out of nowhere. And so building up that dialogue was really important to the success and the ultimate community happiness with the project. Some lessons we learned as part of this project are, again, engaging early, tying into that timing tentpole that we talked about earlier, and creating a dialogue to avoid presenting decisions as predetermined when possible. Coming in and saying, this is what we're doing, eroded some of the trust between the community and the design team, and having a more collaborative process helps people feel some ownership over the changes that they were going to see. When that wasn't possible, providing clarity on how decisions were reached, being able to point to data that we had collected saying, look, people are going really fast, and we know that speed tables might help slow people down in this neighborhood, or we know that crossing feels really unsafe, so a raised crossing will help pedestrians get across the road more safely. So providing that clarity and grounding your recommendations in data that you've collected while also acknowledging community needs and habits. I have one opinion about what I like my streets to look like, but that may not match everyone else's. And so anticipating equity questions and then utilizing community partners for outreach. This was something that we're seeing on a lot of projects now, where community partners can help with the resource lift and intensity of community engagement sometimes, and they already have those community ties that are really beneficial to maintain that dialogue and trust. Another design project that we worked on, the Belmont Community Path. This was a path, a town-led MassDOT funded greenway. That's part of the Mass Central Rail Trail. Because this was a MassDOT funded project, we did use the kind of traditional public design hearings. But then we also had some site walks with abutters and some focus groups, particularly around tree removal. This was a very green space, and people care a lot about trees, as they should. But that was some of our lessons learned as well. So asking for feedback early in the process, what would make people feel comfortable with this project? What are their priorities for it? Continuing that dialogue. And then considering what's feasible. There was some miscommunication around some trees that people thought were going to be able to be saved and preserved through the project, but unfortunately they had to come down, and that miscommunication created a lot of confusion and pushback from the community. Obviously, like, people want to save trees. I don't want to take down a tree either, but considering what you know when you know it, and not communicating as clearly as possible about when you'll have that information. And then looking at maintaining some of our existing infrastructure, the Carlisle Pavement Management Plan. This was an inventory and assessment of all the pavement within the town of Carlisle, and it quantified the pavement condition to guide future maintenance and investment in the pavement condition throughout town. So this incorporated spatial GIS, and other versions have incorporated live mapping tools to identify priority spots. This also translates the technical aspects into visualizations that people can understand and explains priorities for DPW maintenance. So even though this project lifespan didn't necessarily include community engagement, this is now a tool that future engagement can use to say, we're planning on repaving this road at this point because, as we said here, or as we found in the pavement management plan, this will prevent larger issues moving forward, and communicated that priority and trade-offs. And Allison will take us through a couple more.
Yes, so we recently worked on a zoning overlay in Hubbardston, and while I know that is not typically a project that lives within DPWs, there were some lessons here and some great conversations we had with those folks that really helped inform this project. So we led the project, but also the community engagement effort on the zoning overlay project of, again, an old sand pit. We had a few obstacles here. There was public distrust based on the history of the site. They wanted to, they were scared that we didn't have the community's best interests in mind. And there were a lot of significant infrastructure constraints here that actually involved us having conversations with the nearby town of Gardner's DPW as well. We came in with a very traditional public meeting here, and because of this distrust and also the specific people that came out, we had to pivot during the meeting and kind of meet them where they are. So again, bringing that in they wanted to have a bit of a deeper conversation and talk about more of the external factors that led to this project versus just talking about the project. So again, bringing things back to previous community conversations and connecting our projects to the larger web of influences and planning documents and everything else towns are always making really helped enrich that conversation. We had to address some of their concerns directly, not talk around them, not just say, well, let's just talk about the project, that we met them where they were in terms of what they wanted to talk about. But we were solution oriented in those discussions rather than relitigating the past. We had some small group discussions at this meeting to allow for deeper conversation. And because infrastructure was such a critical constraint on this project, it really meant that we had to have DPW involvement earlier so that later on when things start to come online for this project, it's not DPW coming in and being the bad guy because they hadn't been involved earlier. So a few lessons there from a non-DPW project, but this is just your sign to, if you hear of something like this going on in your town, maybe if you're not being reached out to directly, trying to get more directly involved to save some grief down the line. Move and again, those grant applications that Maddie was talking about earlier, we've assisted a few towns in grant applications, and a common thing, and we're seeing more and more for state funding, is that they want these projects to have a community engagement and community education portion of the application. And that's led us to getting creative about what that could look like. Carlisle, we recently helped them with an application for culvert upgrades. And while that doesn't sound like maybe the most project that lends itself most easily to community engagement, we got creative there in proposing website upgrades, which is, a very solid, dependable approach. But we then also integrated a butter mailings, signage, and tabling around the project to strengthen that application. Braintree Park, this one was great. If you have an application for any sort of infrastructure within a place that the community can access. In this case, it was seawall upgrades at Watson Park in Braintree. Options there, of course, include a website, and we brought in the possibility of educational signage after the project was built to then extend that community engagement. And they are actually having an in-person event at the park for a different project, but it's a great kind of event we can bring in to meet this need on a grant application, which is offering an in-person event to make it more educational after the project is already done and in construction. That can either be tailored towards other industry professionals or towards the public. So again, if it's a place where the community can access, offering an event on site is just a great, more creative approach to that engagement requirement than maybe just a website or just signage that we typically offer. We've also had some great engagement-informed grant success. We had a project in Holyoke, a feasibility study that was very similar to that Revere Walk, Bike, and Roll that Maddie mentioned earlier. But because of the public outreach portion of this project, an online survey, a neighborhood site walk, a virtual public meeting, we were able to leverage engagement that had already happened to support our grant application, and actually 2 more successful grant applications for improvements on this corridor. So, the lesson learned from there is that, some of the support you may want for your applications or need could already exist. It doesn't necessarily have to be another effort added to your project, but leveraging what engagement the town has already done, even if it's not for a grant application, even if it's just for educating on a project that's coming online, can really help ground our applications and our work towards the community. And again, I know something we all probably deal with daily here is MS4 compliance. So we've helped towns approach that education and engagement requirement in unique ways as well. So for our efforts in Oxford, we made a brochure and posters and brought them to table at an existing community event. In this case, it was the Town of Oxford Arbor Day. We had some representatives there giving out trees anyway. So we were there with our approachable materials that kind of made MS4 compliance, more digestible to the public. So we were able to meet the education requirement, not just via a Concom presentation or a planning board presentation, but somewhere where people already were. And that kind of increased visibility for the department's work and got them, realize that, their local DPW is working for them every day in ways they don't see, and strengthen those community partnerships.
And fresh off the presses this week, we were working on this community engagement effort. Pictured here, not pictured, is the snow that fell just prior to this. But this is the Boston Green and Safe Routes to School, where it is a combination of providing traffic calming and safer routes for kids to get dropped off at school, as well as implementing really great green infrastructure strategies that provides co-benefits such as like adding more shade. And right now it's really just an asphalt concrete island. And so communicating some of the co-benefits to what is traditionally just infrastructure improvements was a really critical component of how we developed our community engagement material for this project. We really met people where they were on this project. We attended pickup and drop off for parents dropping off kids to school and picking them up. They parked along the curb line and we approached cars and had flyers in our hands that had all of the project information, things that parents would want to know about when construction was expected to start, some renderings of what was expected to be developed, what some of these benefits would look like. And we also had a QR code on the engagement material that allowed these parents, if they had questions, if they couldn't read the flyer then, they could go home and they could provide feedback through the QR code. Additionally, we published these flyers in 4 different languages, in the top languages spoken within the community, and it was great. We were running back to grab Spanish and Haitian Creole flyers from the tables and just making sure we had what the community was asking for and needed so we could reach the most people and get the best feedback. So now just an overview. We've gone through quite a few tools, and this next section will just be some like quick hits on other ideas that can be engaged. The one on the right is actually a clip from the town of Braintree Elder Affairs. They were working on a stormwater management system. It was basically a bioretention planter. And this question was, where do my tax dollars go? And so what was developed was a really creative interpretation of how to show something that might be a little dull, but also everyone's asking about where the money is being spent or where it's from. A receipt. They used this receipt to just show what grant funding was available and how this project was getting paid for. And it was something that was used to communicate this to stakeholders, to community residents, and could answer questions that could be just hard to track down data-wise. So something like this is really helpful in publishing information that meets people where they are, is accessible, aesthetic, engaging. So creative visualizations. Also, I'm sure a lot of you either already do this or are aware of these resources, but online live mapping tools. When we were on site for the Boston Green and Safe Routes to School, someone literally said, I'm going to 311 this when they saw a pole broken on the ground and some trash. And I think it's just a great tool for the community to know that they can provide feedback, and then the DPW can either use that or whoever has the link to that can use that for future projects. Other ideas would be open office hours for dropping in dialogue, the QR codes, like I mentioned, tabling at those existing events, what's already happening in your community and how can you show up with material or engage people where they are. How can you partner with local schools and community groups? A couple other projects use this example, but walking and talking site tours where people can see and together they can talk about what the context is and where they have any touch points. And then collaborating with local businesses who are often very impacted by some of these frontage changes. So we're going to dive into a few more just overviews of what some of these tools could be. So this is what we did for Schoolmaster Hill project. We used illustrative diagrams to help residents visualize what some of these changes were going to be. We added color, we added callouts. As you also know, plans don't always translate to communities. It's black and white. There's a lot of information going on. So being able to take that a step further and add an illustration to it can draw the attention to what matters for the community. Another example of visualizations, the Mass DEP stormwater requirements, dense, hard to read through. Instead of asking residents to read through that, we translated them into a 3D graphic that makes the changes and concrete points more visible and pointed out the important information. This helped translated really technically dense information into very approachable visuals. Our next tool is live mapping. Like I mentioned, a 311 tool could be hosted on a city webpage. Constituents themselves can identify problem areas within their communities and neighborhoods. And it's also just a great data source of future project potential where DPW might need to focus on investing to just take care of a problem if it looks like things are concentrating. It's just a great tool to be able to see any potential flooding or like nuisance potholes, things like that. Office hours. So office hours are great for allowing people to engage on their own schedule. If they can't make a formal meeting, these can be hosted in person or virtually, and it doesn't pressure people to like show up to a specific meeting on time. These one-on-ones tend to encourage a little bit more honest dialogue and creative dialogue, and they can spark conversations. And it also shows that the department or the design team is open and accessible to them as the community. Story maps and web pages were also mentioned earlier, but we wanted to point out this one example we used on Strawberry Fields development, where we were trying to close the loop back. So we often ask community members for their input, for them to tell us what matters to them, but we don't always go back to them and say, we heard you and this is what we heard. So a tool like this, a story map posted on a web page, can really show that their information was synthesized, documented, and either maybe a trade-off was talked about where like we can't necessarily pull off this task that you're asking, or we can, and this is how we incorporated it. And so having a website hosted for your project or your project engagement can really help people feel like they see themselves and their efforts in your project. This is just another picture of another story map we used. The reason we like this one is because of that rendered section that helps give residents more of a concrete look at what the changes will actually look like for a project. This can really help the residents see that, especially if it's iterative, some of their feedback may be incorporated in real time into the design, and it can help encourage future engagement as well. Educational signage. This one is particularly great because not every resident can make it to a meeting or maybe find that story map online. But they probably will walk past your project site at some point and see that the signage meets them where they are. And the best part about this is that it can explain the reasoning behind a design decision and extend the life of that engagement long after the design team rolls out because you have these touch points left behind for the community. Tabling, this is from that same Boston Safe Routes to School. Not every resident is going to make it to a meeting like we were talking about. So going out into the community, tracking them down and handing out a flyer and allowing them to engage on their own terms. I think specifically the QR box or a touch point that allows people to come back when they have the time. People are busy, parents dropping off kids, not always the best time to have an open dialogue. So providing a flexible and adaptive tool is great for people that are on the go. In summary, we've learned a lot here today, hopefully, or at least we really learned a lot, even in putting these slides together and synthesizing what kind of projects worked really well and what we wished we had done differently. Good community engagement, though, does just come down to a few things. It's starting early, giving residents ownership where the design allows, and meeting people where they are. Part of clarifying project goals and community priorities means communicating some of those trade-offs pretty honestly. Sometimes engineering requirements or regulations or budget constraints means that you just can't do everything that the community wants, and that's okay. Residents, though, are better served by a clear explanation about that than being surprised at the end. So using some of these tools to either close the loop or show the design decisions that came from community engagement can be really effective. When engagement is done well, it surfaces constraints, use patterns, it surfaces concerns that actually genuinely can improve a project design. The community is just a ripe source of existing project information that we don't always think about when we're trying to get a project off the ground. Luckily, we have a slew of tools at our disposal, and this will help us meet with the community where they are and share information in creative ways. Not all these tools require a dedicated engagement budget or communication team. Most of them require just a willingness to start the design early and the conversation early. And as we found, projects that the communities help shape are the projects that the communities actually use.
So with that, we wanted to say thank you very much. Thank you for sticking with us these last 40 minutes, and we love to open the floor for any questions you all have right now.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
I got one for anyone to answer. How many folks do you usually have on each team that goes into public engagement for a given project?
I would say we usually have one as a community engagement lead who's meeting with the design team periodically throughout the project, just because, you know, design deadlines and permitting deadlines generally impact how we approach community engagement. So I'll generally stay in contact with the design PM at a couple key points throughout the project. And then when it comes time to produce materials, it's generally maybe me, one other engagement specialist, and then the designer, one or two engineers on the project when it comes to crunch time. But when we have meetings, we like to bring in, you know, not just me who maybe can't answer a heavy duty green infrastructure question, but we like to have representatives from the design team as well because they're better able to explain those technological trade-offs.
I'd also just be curious if anyone has any experience with engagement, what that's looked like for you in your role. I think we're all also curious of how transferable is some of this and what you think of it in your roles that you have.
I guess I'll chime in on that. I do engagement for our firm as well, and we also utilize things like EDDM through the post office to get public information out. We've done some like presentations and flyer handouts like at town vote. So there are restrictions around it, but certain communities when they're trying to pass bond votes for the funding of the projects, we have done some outside, you know, booth tabling to allow us to pass some of that information along as well.
I love that. I love the idea of bringing it to another town event. That's probably the engaged people that you want to hear.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I thank you so much, Allison, Chanel, and Madeline. This was really informative. Just a note that this is recorded. We will have this available on the Connecticut T2's YouTube page, as well as we will get it up on the New England APWA webpage as well. So this will become available probably next week. The link will be there. I did just have a QR code and there's also a link if you can all take a moment just to fill out that evaluation form. We just really want to hear from you. This is our first webinar of the year. We just want to know what type of topics you'd like to see from us going forward or how we can make this webinar experience better for all of you. So if you could just take a moment to fill that out, that would be wonderful. Oh, hold on. We actually have some questions, though. Here they come in. Cameron Rowe from Town of Chester, Connecticut. We have a weekly emails for residents who sign up for it. That's how they get their community engagement. And then Michael B., any thoughts on how you continue to engage with the public after a project has been approved and the gap between project design approval and construction to start? That's a great question, Michael.
I think that first comment may have answered our second question, which is including those regular updates in those emails, or I know a lot of people a lot of towns use Facebook to reach out to their constituents or other social media. But I think a regular update on those projects that are in that weird in between stage really helps, you know, establish that precedent of transparency and build relationships with the community along the way. And then, you know, those are generally going to meet your more engaged people versus, say, tabling, which is not, but those are the people who are going to be asking, hey, we thought that seawall project was coming online. Where is it?
I think another strategy for that one too is building up project signage, even if it's at the site that says changes are coming, like scan this QR code or visit this website to learn more. That can help people stay informed about the changes that are coming and when they could expect to see it.
Right, like removing the
helps.
element of surprise from
the
project is a really important part. And I think another way we could have sorted these tools would be when in a timeline that they seem appropriate to happen. Like what happens at early engagement versus like signage that's left over at the end. which is my answer to Alfredo's question. But I was gonna, Allison, if you have any other thoughts to.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that's also a really good time to set up and get ahead of like future impacts, construction and street closures and everything. That's something at our effort on Tuesday because it's a street project that we made sure we included in that material was, how is this actually going to impact on the ground? And we didn't have a lot of answers yet, but we acknowledged it as a future question people would have. So not trying to skate around it.
All right. And as Chanel mentioned, Alfredo, so we'll have Chanel answer first and we'll go down line. What's your favorite way to present a project to the public?
If we're talking towards the end of the project, I really love educational signage. I think getting the buy-in of what education can do to describe the movement of water, um, or like in a bioretention plant or some type of infrastructure that's traditionally just not talked about, what the co-benefits of making a space greener can help increase stewardship of that said project later on and make it something that's integrated into the community. So those touch points of like, what am I looking at? I think through educational signage is a really awesome way to do that. And there are a lot of creative ways to do it.
Madeline, what about you?
I actually really enjoy tabling at existing events. I think it's a really cool way to connect with the community and see what everyone cares about and get a sense of the life in the community as well. Bringing in visualizations to help share those ideas as well to get ahead of some of the surprises that we were talking about that we want to avoid. And yeah.
All right. Well, and Alfredo just asked another question and we'll have Allison take it. What have you found to be the most effective way for controversial topics?
Yeah, I not avoiding them. I think, I equate it to when I used to work in restaurants and people's food would be late, and all they want to hear you say is, "Yeah, we know your food's late. We're really sorry." So sometimes just acknowledging and validating that what people are going through is frustrating. Um, We've also but that is also an opportunity on like a more technical level to bring in data and trade-offs and educational components. Because a lot of times the controversial fact is those trade-offs that people don't know exist and regulatory requirements, is what I find. But yeah, anything where you can back yourselves up and make things not appear out of thin air. And I think also, as Maddie mentioned, for the Commons Highway project, having a community partner in that one was really helpful, if that's something that's available to your project.
Yeah, as
Okay.
Lisa said in
Go
the
ahead.
chat, just transparency, helping with that trust. I think that's really important. Sorry to cut you off.
No, I was going to actually say exactly what Lisa said. And Allison, I love that you brought up the food industry because I feel like it's like I've learned more from working the years in college in the food industry than I actually did in college of like how to deal with people and just like communication, be open, be honest, and it comes through.
Yeah, yeah, in the trenches.
Yeah, in the weeds.
Yeah. Um,
Okay, and before we let everyone go, is any one last
we just wanted to, sorry, and I'll let
go ahead,
everyone
Allison.
speak. We just wanted to mention that our firm is hosting a webinar if you're in the educational mood, about leveraging practical asset management for municipal infrastructure. Just going to drop that link in the chat, but I'll stand down now if anyone else has something to say.
Perfect. All right, I just tried it. It works. And the date of that is April 16th at 1 o'clock. So mark your calendars, register, and see these lovely ladies speak again. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day. Thank you, Madeline,
Thank
Chanel, and
you.
Allison.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Pat.
Everyone.